that you're muted if you're not talking. And also, we're using Google Meet, which Megan will explain in a second why we've chosen this format. It's the first time. So I'm going to hand it over to Megan to just kind of open things up.
Hi all, thanks for joining so much, and to our presenters for coming and sharing your evening with us. We are using Google Meet because for all of its quirks, it has very superior accessibility features. So anyone who needs closed captioning can just click on at the bottom of your computer screen on the right, turn on closed captions, and you can also find that on your phone. And for those who may not be able to hear that, I will put it in the chat periodically. So thanks so much for coming, spending your evening with us, and exploring this new system in the name of accessibility.
Great, thank you. So can you see me? Because it looks like my screen is black, but you can see me? It's odd. Okay, all right. So hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you. So my name is Evie Hanzopoulos, and thank you for coming to tonight's panel. We're going to be focusing on housing, and I'm really happy to have such accomplished housing activists here tonight who are going to share their expertise with you. I want everyone to know that we are trying to record this panel tonight. Like Megan said, we're using Google Meets, which we're not as familiar with as Zoom, but we are going to try and record it so that we have it and can possibly share it. Also, just want you to know the format for this evening. We're going to really try and keep to an hour, and I want to just quickly review the agenda. So I'm going to start off by just kind of giving an overview, introduce each of the panelists, which will have about 10 minutes each to speak, and then following the presentations, we'll have time for questions and answers. So if you do have a question, please put your question in the chat. If you're on the phone, when the time comes, you can unmute yourself and ask your question if you want to do that. Like I said, we're going to try and allow an hour for the event. If we need a few more minutes, if people want to talk, that's fine too, but we want to be respectful of people's time. So, you know, housing is an issue personally to me. That is something that's been really, really important. As chair of the Community Board 1 Housing Committee, I've really learned a lot about housing in this district and just how urgent a crisis we are facing. Obviously, you know, anyone who's been in Astoria for a while, I've been here for 22 years, has really seen how gentrification and luxury development and along with speculation has really caused rents and housing prices to skyrocket. So it's really become a place where traditionally had been, you know, a place that anybody could really kind of come to and build a life, but it's really become, I think, unattainable for a lot of folks. And that's reflected in everything, of course, like I said, the rising rents, but also the number of homeless that we're experiencing, not just here in this district, but also across the city. So tonight, what we're going to do is learn about and explore some ideas for addressing the housing crisis, recognizing that, of course, it's going to require a coordinated effort among our federal, our state, and our city government. That said, there are steps that we can take as a city to address the housing crisis, and to give us more information on that, we have these 4 panelists. So I'm going to start off by introducing each of the panelists, and then each of them present individually. So I want to start with Memo. Memo Salazar was born in Mexico, eventually made his way to Queens by way of Toronto and Boston. He lives in Sunnyside, where he has been co-running the Sunnyside CSA since 2008. He is a writer who writes about national and local issues, and he's also a filmmaker who made a Public Enemy music video, which I thought was interesting, and I didn't know that about you, Memo. That is super cool. And he's currently working on an educational series with Sesame Workshop, which is going to focus on the Rohingya population living in Bangladesh. So welcome, Memo. He is a founding member and the current co-chair of the Western Queens Community Land Trust. That's where I met him. I'm on the steering committee there as well. He'll be talking about community land trusts. Next up, we have Stan Morse, who's a lead organizer for the Justice for All Coalition, as well as a candidate for Queensborough president. He grew up in public housing, and Stan's life experiences has made housing justice a major part of both his work and his campaign. So he has seen lots of suffering in Nycha, disinvestment all around in different public housing developments, and seen how those are causing high rents, gentrification, and disregard for affordable housing. So he's committed to working with concerned citizens to make the changes that Queens needs now more than ever. So welcome, Stan. Thank you for being here. We did a lot of organizing together in Nycha this past, I guess, 6 months or so. So it's been great working with him. Next up, we have Kristen Hackett, who's an activist, scholar, educator, working towards a decolonized, anti-racist, and just urban futures in New York City. She's an executive committee member of the Justice for All Coalition, a volunteer-based community group comprised of neighbors advocating and organizing around just futures for all in Western Queens. She is also she's a PhD candidate and a fellow at the Graduate Center at CUNY. In focusing on environmental psychology. She has written lots of amazing pieces that have been published in City Limits and the East New York News, and I have loved working with her around housing issues. So welcome, Kristen. And last but not least is Rohit Chandan. He's a housing attorney who lives in Astoria, and he volunteers with the Astoria Tenant Union, about a year-old organization that is really bringing much-needed services and support to tenants here who are dealing with housing issues, including the threat of eviction, lack of repairs, and housing violations. So with that, I want to kind of kick it off, and we're going to start with Memo. Is that okay? Are you ready? Okay, cool. So we're going to start with, yeah. So you got about 10 minutes, Memo, and you'll kick us off. Once again, as you're listening, if you have any questions as they come up, just throw them in the chat, and we will try and get to them. Either, yeah, we're good. Great. Thank you so much, Memo. So CLTs as a way to, um, you know, have permanently affordable housing, and thinking about how the tax lien sale, rather than it going, the money going to banks, it goes to fund CLTs, right? And then even those people whose homes are being foreclosed on, they could actually even stay in their property. It's just that the ownership would go over to the CLT, right? Great. Thank you so much. All right. So I'm sure we're going to have some questions later for you on that. So great. Great overview of CLTs. Next, I'm going to hand it over to Stan Morse, who, as I mentioned before, is an organizer, tenant organizer with Justice for All Coalition, and works primarily in Nycha, helping to organize Nycha residents. So Stan, take it away. You got 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Again, my name is Stan Morse. I grew up in public housing in Brooklyn, Lafayette Gardens, and Bed-Stuy. So that's why the issue is really personal to me. And at the time, you have to understand, Nights was not always a bad place to live. When I first moved into that development, it was very well kept. Grass was always clean. Elevators always worked. So the issues that you see in Nights today were not there back in the beginning. But over years of disinvestment, for decades, these developments went from decent developments to kind of what you see today. And what you see today is gas outages. You see elevators not working. You see just total destruction, of these developments. And that's really done on purpose, And what you find is that many NYCHA residents living in these developments have become conditioned to it and actually are, in some sense, being retaliated against when they fight to organize a fight back. So again, you see gas outages in Astoria. We had gas outages and heat going off in various developments, and it's really a horrible condition. But what we're doing it as an organization is we're fighting with tenants to really get them to stand up. And one of the things we're getting them to do is actually consider lawsuits against their management offices. Many times they go down, they make complaints, they get disrespected, to be perfectly honest. The repairs never get done. Most of the elected officials tend to ignore it, and the issues go on and go on and go on. And one of the reasons why tenants are afraid to speak out is there have been instances where they've been retaliated against and actually have their apartments threatened and threatened to take from them. So while all this is happening, we see, just like in my neighborhood, developments going bad, but you see all around the neighborhood, all these buildings going up. You see the gentrification, you see all the overdevelopment, but nothing comes to the residents of NYCHA. Oftentimes, there's promises of jobs to be given to NYCHA residents. Those jobs never materialize when the development projects come. And the cycle just goes on and on and on and on and on. So what we've been doing lately is, again, organizing residents and getting them to file what we call letters of complaint. A letter of complaint is not a ticket. It's actually a legal document that goes to the management office and begins to hold them accountable. And we have, at this point in time, maybe 150 of these residents who filed these letters of complaints, really all throughout the city. And so out of that group of people that have done that, we have 10 to 12 in each development that are now stepping up and are prepared to have lawsuits against their NYCHA development. So we're hoping that these lawsuits will be the first big step to really hold NYCHA accountable. Another tactic we're organizing tenants to do is to actually hold back your rent. It's really horrible when folks live in these horrible conditions, but yet they're paying their rent faithfully. And I think a lot of people have a misconception on how much rent NYCHA tenants pay. There's some people living in NYCHA paying $1,900 a month. So it's not just all low-income folks, as the perception is. It's a lot of people that sometimes pay a decent amount, but can't get a decent place to live. And I can't really, I can't tell you how horrible the stories are. You have a situation where a lady 74 years old is without heat for months. You have situations where people have no gas and cannot cook. You have situations where the elevators don't work and you're a senior citizen and you're stuck. And imagine having to walk 15, 16 flights of stairs to get to your apartment, when the elevators don't work. these are constant situations that happen over and over and over again. And all the federal government and all our city and state government wants to do, instead of fixing and fully funding NYCHA, is talk about privatizing it. That's their main thing. So you may hear things like the Blueprint, or you may hear RAD. These are all programs created that will eventually move NYCHA residents out of their homes. And we're fighting to make sure that that does not happen. The solution can't be kick a resident out or privatize the development. The solution has to be to fully fund NYCHA and bring the kind of funding that it needs. And that's a huge fight. So we're now going to be targeting HUD. We have Joe Biden in office, so now he's going to be the target. What are they going to do to fully fund NYCHA? We also believe in a Green New Deal for NYCHA, to actually fix these buildings, which are literally falling apart. So we're really fighting to get these residents to stand up, but it's very difficult because, again, when you do fight back, you are retaliated against, and it's really unfair. It's really criminal, in the way they're being treated and the way they're being forced to accept these conditions. So the main thing with NYCHA residents today is stand up, make sure that we have our voices heard, and we fight and we overturn the way the system is going, which is really destroying the lives of so many people. I mean, I really can't. If I told you stories, it would make all of us here cry, because it really is. It's heartbreaking, So hopefully, we're able to get a Green New Deal pushed through. We're hoping for that. We're also hoping that these lawsuits can go forward in Ravenswood, Queensbridge, Astoria houses, and Woodside houses. We're also hoping the residents agree to go on strike, to really take the onus to say, if I can't get a decent place to live, then why am I continuing to pay my rent? And that's very common sense, to us. But again, residents are afraid, and they are afraid of being retaliated against. So it's a long fight that we're having, and we're hoping that we can force these NYCHA to stand up and do what it has to do, and not privatize NYCHA, not do the Blueprint. We don't want RAG. We don't want any of these privatization schemes, which really is going to end up forcing NYCHA residents out of their development and will contribute to the rise in rent in our communities. And we're trying desperately to fight against that. So again, it's not just an issue for people living in NYCHA. If you don't live in NYCHA, it should concern you as well, because these situations are affecting the whole borough of Queens, and it really is horrible and terrible. So once again, I take it personally because I grew up there, and it really shouldn't be the way it is, and it wasn't always that way, and it can be different if the residents stand up and fight back.
So Stan, I just want to ask a clarifying question for those folks who may not be familiar with RAD. You mentioned RAD and the Blueprint, right? In terms of, so what is RAD? And what does that possibly mean for folks who live in NYCHA or for public housing in general?
Well, RAD is a situation where they're going to give a 99-year lease to a private entity, and that private entity will then manage the development. So once that happens, that development is no longer considered NYCHA. It's under the management of this private management. And in many cases, they pick slumlords, to be these managers. And what they also don't tell residents is that a resident can actually manage these developments themselves, and that's the one part that never comes out, and the information is never given to these residents, is that they could form resident management corporations and literally manage the property themselves, and they probably do a better job if they got a stake in it, as opposed to giving it management over to a private entity for 99 years, which would actually be the end of NYCHA as we see it. Then there's another one called the Blueprint, which is a public trust, which in effect will be more or less the same thing, a private entity controlling these developments and really not giving the NYCHA residents any say-so in how the developments are run, and really putting them in a position where they will ultimately be kicked out of their homes. We believe that's the real goal of it, is to get these apartments to be market rate rent, so they can continue to make more money from it. And I want to stress, and this is done on purpose. In order for these developments to come in, these private developers, the buildings and the apartments had to become so bad and so terrible that they would not be able to pass a HUD inspection. So think about that. They let these buildings fall apart on purpose in order to make it profitable and open the door for a private developer to come in and buy them, instead of fully funding NYCHA like it should be done. So I think the plan has been insidious. It's been they're doing it now in the middle of a pandemic, which is even more insidious. When people cannot organize, folks are struggling to get on Zoom. Yet you have the city and private developers together trying to push this plan through this year, which will actually be the end of public housing in New York City as we know it. So it's really criminal that they would do this in the middle of a pandemic instead of really focusing on giving these folks a real decent place to live.
Thank you, Stan. All right, I'm sure people will have questions for you towards the end. So thanks so much for that overview of what's happening in Nycha and our public housing. And, here in Western Queens, between Astoria houses, Ravenswood, and Queensbridge, that's a lot of public housing units that we're talking about here. Comprises a pretty large number. So it's really important to kind of think about that housing. A lot of people just aren't even familiar with Nycha who live in the community, but it's an important part of the affordable housing stock here. So thanks so much. I'm going to go next to Rohit, if he is ready, who is going to talk about, like I said, he's a housing attorney who's going to talk about, what some tenants have been experiencing and the work that he does. So take it away, Rohit. Thank you.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? So I'm going to start off with the PowerPoint. Let's see if it works. Yeah, can you all see my screen? Is it working? Okay, cool. So
just real quick.
Sorry. So I'm going to start off with basically the first two slides. It's going to be Know Your Rights slides. Just going to go over it real quick. So if you are a rent stabilized tenant, you have a lot of rights. And I tried to put on this thing, but basically to find out if you're rent stabilized, if you live in a big building, if it's got 6 units or more and built between, I think, built before 1974, it should be rent stabilized pretty much automatically. And there's a website I'll put in the chat where you can check if you are. But if you are rent stabilized, it's literally a game changer, for your renting life, because the landlord doesn't get to decide how much the rent increase will be. It's the city. So for an example, I'm rent stabilized right now, and for next year, my lease cannot increase. It's 0% because that's what the city voted for. And one great thing is that, if I have issues with my landlord, not only do I have the right to organize against her, but I can also take it to DHCR, the state agency, and if there's issues, they can even reduce my rent. But if you're not rent stabilized, you don't get those rights. Two other rights that, to be honest, I don't know as well, but I wish I did, especially for work, is that if you are elderly or you're disabled and you meet the qualifications, you can not only have your rent frozen, but the city will pay a portion of your rent as well. The applications, I think, can now be done online, and it's pretty straightforward. If you're not rent stabilized, you still have a good amount of rights, though. Once you're a tenant, you cannot be evicted except through a judge in a housing court. And even once the judge says you're evicted, it's only the marshal that can carry out the eviction. So your landlord can't be like, yo, you owe $30,000 in rent and you don't have a lease, so you have to get out. They still have to take you through a housing court, and where it can take usually a lot of months and whatnot. And even when they sue you, you can still countersue. Do you get repairs? You can get your rent reduced if you don't have proper repairs, that kind of stuff as well. So to be honest, housing court is usually not too effective for tenants, but you still have that right to fight back through it. But personally, I think organizing is always more effective than lawsuits. But yeah. So this is a breakdown of rent stabilized apartments in Astoria. As you can see, and there's going to be a picture, it's a lot of market rate apartments, but there's also a lot of rent stabilized apartments as well. And the reason I have this is because I think there's a huge image of Astoria as just like a lot of rich white yuppies living here. But the reality is there's still a lot of people of color, immigrants, Black people, Indigenous people that still live in Astoria. The only reason they can afford it is because a lot of apartments are still rent stabilized. Unfortunately, we see it all the time that more and more apartments are becoming illegally destabilized. So, sorry. And what that means is before 2019, if your rent got above $2,700, your landlord could take the apartment out of rent stabilization and make it a market unit. So it was easy for them to harass tenants, kick them out, increase the rent by 20%, get a new tenant, harass, kick them out, and vice versa. But since 2019, just through tenant organizing, really, and the organization Housing Justice for All, we were able to finally close that loophole. So now if an apartment is rent stabilized, it's rent stabilized for life. But it's still shitty because, these laws are not really enforced by the city or the state. It's really up to the tenant to do it. So I see this all the time, just through tenants union and work. I know an apartment is rent stabilized. The rent cannot increase by 1%, but I look at their past leases and the tenant doesn't know their rent stabilized. So they might be paying, $200 more every month than they should. And we have to fight back. Usually the tenant has to fight back by either going through housing court and asking for the rent to get reduced, or we work with them to build tenant associations where they can, build power to get it reduced as well, just by direct action and really fighting your landlord. And the last thing is going to be the Astoria Not for Sale. This is a campaign Astoria Tenants Union is working on. Despite all the luxury towers we got going on in Astoria, Silverstein off Northern Boulevard wants to build more high-rise luxury development, and partially because it's a tax opportunity zone, so they don't really have to pay taxes. They can get a tax abatement. And, this is where I live. It's still a lot of working class people and mom and pop bodegas and businesses. And a lot of these businesses are going to close down if if this rezoning takes place, because it's in a lot of luxury towers pushing out smaller groups. And really, Evie does deserve a shout out over here because she has been helping us figure out what's going on with the rezoning, but also personally helping me understand how the city agency DCP works, how they fight the rezoning, the interweavings of the government agencies that I don't usually personally give a shit about, but it is really helpful to know about it. And having someone like Evie that has that experience and knowledge has really helped us out. So I wanted to give her a quick shout out. I think that's it for mine. The last slide. If you are a tenant in New York State and you're worried about facing an eviction, or you have a housing court case or anything, you can do this website over here. It will take you to an online website where you can fill out a hardship declaration. And the minute you sign it, it sends it automatically to court and your landlord, and it'll make sure that you can't be evicted until May 1st or after. And if you have a housing court case, it's automatically frozen until after May 1st as well. So yeah, I know that's a lot of information, so sorry for going fast, but that's me, and that's my part of the presentation.
Thank you, Rohit. I think it's really interesting to see how much of the rent stabilized units we've lost over the years, right? So, and those haven't been replaced, right? Like, we've lost those units. They've gone off the rent stabilization rules. And yet I think we're all kind of seeing the kind of development that's been going up, which makes, I think, housing even more unaffordable for people here. So thanks for that presentation, and also for all you're doing to help people stay in their homes. And I think it'll be not interesting. I don't know what the right word is, just to see what happens after the moratorium, officially ends, right?
Yeah, we're pushing for cancel rent legislation to get passed and hopefully extend the moratorium as well. And one really interesting thing about the cancel rent legislation is that not only cancels rent for tenants, but it also makes it that where landlords have to file the hardship application in order to get money from the state, which I think is personally a game changer, because the burden's always been on tenants to apply for unemployment, apply for scree. It's always on us to prove that we're worthy for it. But for once, it'll flip the table and make the landlords prove that they need the money.
Thank you. All right. So last but certainly not least is Kristen Hackett, who, as I mentioned before, she is also part of Justice for All Coalition, and she is a PhD candidate at CUNY Grad Center, and has really done a lot of really, really interesting work around housing issues, public housing and zoning, and she's going to talk about zoning and gentrification. So take it away, Kristen.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to try and share my screen as well. Let's see. It's telling me that I can't.
See if we can figure that out. Then you can't?
Let me see.
You may have to refresh your screen.
Hold on. I don't know. I feel like this might be a minute. And a lot of what I wanted to show is like showing that. Let me think about.
What happens when it's where it says present now? It's just not allowing you to present.
Like going, it says go to your system preferences. It's not like that straightforward.
Okay.
Let me see. Yeah, I mean, maybe. I should have tried it. So what do you, I don't know, maybe it's, I shouldn't. I don't know. I don't want to take up. Yeah, I
So
can't do
could we
that.
maybe answer a couple questions for the other panelists, and then that'll give you a second? I know that's not
Okay.
what we talked about, but that'll give you like 2 minutes.
Yeah, I can't really restart my browser though right now.
Oh,
Okay.
I can like share some stuff in the chat and kind of talk through it maybe. Some of it can't be shared, which is unfortunate, but okay.
You might be able to open a new window, like a window of the same browser and log on that way, possibly.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, let me try that. I'll be back. I think.
Let's see if we can take a question while we're getting set here. So, Rohit, there was a question about how a stabilized apartment can be passed along to family members. Is that true?
Yeah, I think I put the fact sheet on the chat, but it's usually pretty straightforward. One thing is that before the new rent laws, just for context, landlords hated succession because once the tenant died, they want to take it out of rent stabilization. But now that it's in rent stabilization for life, they don't really push back. So usually you just have to show that you've been having a residency there for about 6 months to a year, usually a year. And the easiest way is like just showing like birth records, license, that kind of stuff. In my experience, a lot of times a landlord, like the parents will email the landlord and be like, hey, how do I give this apartment to my kid when I pass away? And that's pretty much the easiest way because it shows the kid's been living there and that the tenant is taking action to pass it down. And a lot of times landlords just don't want to fight it back as much anymore because it costs too much in legal fees to fight it back and they're not going to profit.
And then also, since we've lost, 25% of the units here over the years, is there any way to kind of get those apartments back on the rent stabilization rolls? Or is it?
Yeah, there was some legislation statewide that would say, I forget who introduced it, but it was basically that all apartments that have been illegally deregulated can become rent stabilized again. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to make it in the priorities for Albany this year, but they're still pushing for it though, and I'm hoping next year there'll be finally enough momentum where they can stabilize the units that have been illegally deregulated. But it's always such a push. Like, the real estate lobby spends so much money pushing that particular legislation.
Thank you. All right. Well, we're waiting for Kristen to come back on. Let's look at another question. Rebecca was asking, as individuals, what can we do to support community land trusts and bring them to Astoria? Do you want to take that, Memo? Thank you. And I just wanted to add one thing to CLTs. New York City does have a CLT that actually has property, right? Actually, now there's going to be two, but the original CLT in New York City is Cooper Square Community Land Trust, which is on the Lower East Side. And what's incredible is that a 2-bedroom apartment, the rent is $420 a month, which kind of just shows you how with a CLT, you keep housing costs really low. So just, over the years, this is, the rent hasn't gone up like it has in other parts of the city. It's remained at a particular rate. So I thought that like, for me, that like really brought it home when I heard that, like, cause it's all up here, like, oh, CLT, like you get right down to it, like a 2-bedroom apartment, $420 a month, because that land was put into community land trust and it's not on the speculative market. So anyway, Kristen is back. So I'm going to hand it over to her. Welcome back. Hope you had fun out in cyberspace while you were working that out. But take it away,
Yeah,
Kristen.
we'll see if it's worked out. All right, I think we got it. Can you see my screen now? Okay, let's see. All right, so yeah, like Evie said, I came in to talk about gentrification and rezoning, and I come to doing this work as like really a neighbor, somebody who's experienced ongoing displacement across the city, and as somebody who's in grad school now studying it and working with the Justice for All Coalition to like fight against those processes that are making us all move and be displaced all the time. And gentrification and rezoning are kind of like wonky words. So I thought we could actually just look at some maps, and I like to take a historical perspective on stuff. So I'll do some of that too. So gentrification is like, has a lot of connotations, but it can be generally used to describe like neighborhood change. That's not a great description, but that's a starting place for thinking about what we're talking about. And so you should be looking at a map of total housing units in 2000 and 2017. Is that what you're seeing? Hope so. And if you can see that, then you can see how many more units we've been seeing in Western Queens in the last 20 years. And I start the time lapse basically at 2000 because that's really when we start to see like big investment in New York City. It starts to trickle in the 90s, a lot in Manhattan. But then through the early 2000s, it starts to spiral out into like Brooklyn and Upper Manhattan. And now we're really seeing it hit hard in Queens and in the Bronx. And we can start to see that too when we look here, right? That we're seeing a lot more housing units. Manhattan is much fuller here. And like other folks have been talking about, this relates into like higher rents. So there are some folks who are still paying affordable housing, but they live in public housing developments today. Otherwise, everything else is above 1,000. And this becomes really striking when we look at, well, this is showing 1,000 in 2000 and 2017 across the city, same patterns. And more than 1,500 really is what most of us are paying. And just to give some context, that's about like $60,000 a year for somebody that's like what's kind of comfortable. Less than that, you're pinching it a little bit. And that's actually what we're seeing, is that there's a great deal of cost burden, right? So people who the cost of their housing is too expensive in comparison to the income that they're earning. And it's not just changes in rents, right? And the kinds of housing that we're seeing, it's also like population changes. And we look at these things through looking at like education and income and things like that, right? Not everybody is just getting higher degrees. It's like actually people are moving into these areas as well. So there's some population changeover. And this is looking at graduate school, and we can see, and I'm going to talk about this area in just a minute, Long Island City, but this is very different from the rest of the surrounding area in Queens and much more similar to Manhattan and the East Side. And that's, again, kind of that like spillover starting to happen. And there are some like racial connotations here as well. In Western Queens, we don't have I mean, it's more varied than this, but where the Black community is concentrated today is really in the public housing developments, but there were sort of other concentrations in the neighborhood that have gone away over time with this new development that's come. And so it's really important to understand the role actually that the state or that our city and city officials and city agencies play in this process. And the role that they play is through rezoning, really. And rezoning is like changing the rules of the development of a piece of land, right? Whether it can be built for industrial or whether it can be built for mixed use or residential or commercial space. And what we're seeing is a lot of this land is in Western Queens is being transitioned from industrial to mixed use or residential developments, particularly luxury development, some with like a small degree of what might be called affordable, which many of us probably know isn't affordable. And the real use of rezoning is that it makes this land more profitable or more attractive to investors, to private investors, and that's kind of the goal. And so a lot of those changes that we were seeing were actually spurred by rezonings that were led by the city during the Bloomberg administration of that like lower chunk of Long Island City south of the bridge. And this is kind of what the plan was originally. And then in 2001, they rezoned one part of it. In 2004, they rezoned another part. And then in 2008, they rezoned another part. And this led to a dramatic change in the neighborhood, like much taller buildings, much more luxury development. I'm sure many of us have felt that if we're walking down those areas and have seen that in that area and have seen that change. We've also seen it up here in Astoria, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This kind of development led Long Island City not to just experience high rates of development or investment, but was the fastest growing neighborhood in the country at the time by at least one estimate, and certainly up there, getting close to 12 or more than 12,000 units from 2010 to 2016. And this in 2018, this is a map of the developments that were sort of like in the pipeline, whether in different levels of construction or proposal. So just massive, massive investment in this area. And then in 2015, we saw the city propose yet another rezoning, this time that core rezoning, which folks like the Justice for All Coalition fought. This is the chairperson of Justice for All Coalition speaking at a rally, Sylvia White. And eventually that got killed. And part of the reason was because the rezonings that have been going through across the city, and actually I have a map of that as well, are being promised to communities with small levels of it's right here, with small levels of affordable housing, but it's not, the affordability is not deep enough and the number of units is not nearly enough. And around the city, there have been a number of different rezonings like this that have been proposed, many of which have gone through. And I can share this link if you're interested, but in each of these cases, the communities fought back very hard against these, and a number of them fell. And in places like the Bronx, this Jerome Avenue rezoning, and out in East New York out here, it completely decimated industries like the auto industry that neighborhoods in these communities really depended on for good, stable, well-paying jobs. So the city plays a really palpable role in this, and it's not just through these major rezonings, but it's also through supporting these like smaller rezonings that we see in our neighborhood that Rohit kind of talked a little bit about. And we have a few right now, and I'll just mention a couple, right? So the one that Rohit mentioned is that Innovation Queens, which is here, and they need to actually go through a rezoning process. And the city is like basically working with them, I think, to like help them appease the community enough, tell them, here's what you need, this amount of affordable, say these things. And hope that the community kind of accepts it. We're also seeing another rezoning and lots of development out in Hallett's Cove right next to Astoria houses. And actually the city's participated in that in different ways. They actually allocated like $11 million to invest in playgrounds and ball fields and things like that. And that's great, but that was the same exact amount of money that Astoria houses needed to fix the boilers so that they could have reliable heating systems and heat in the winter. Hot water. So that's an interesting choice of priorities, right? And the thing I guess also to mention is that that public money that's being invested in those ball fields and recreation is great for the community, but it also inflates the land values, ensuring that the private developers can charge higher for those rents because there's more community resources in there. And so there's a tension there. There's also Annabelle Basin, which was the Amazon site, and then the site of URLIC, and now the site of some oyster named project, all requiring rezonings, and I think all including parcels of public land to some degree. And that's the same site where Memo's talking about, where the DOE building is down in that same area. And then they're also talking about like expanding this rezoning. So we were looking at some of the city-led rezonings in this area, and they have been eyeing this area between Ravenswood and Queensbridge houses for a long time as well, to try and turn it into what they're calling like a tech hub, something like that. And so a big part of the problem is that residents really just don't have a say. They don't really have a role in the process. A lot of what we're told is that we can participate through this like ULERP process, but community members don't really have any binding say in that. And we're told by experienced housing advocates who've been doing this work before us, right, that you actually need to do all of that advocating and advocacy ahead of time, go to meetings, write op-eds, oppose these projects, because once these projects enter the ULERP, it's basically over, essentially, like unless the city council member opposes. Not even community boards have binding votes. And so in terms of thinking about the elections at the city level, one of the big things on my mind is revamping that land use process so that community members have first and last say in these decisions and whatever development is happening, right? The way that this happens right now is cities propose rezonings and developers propose rezonings, and communities respond to those rezonings or deal with the consequences of them. And we dealt with the consequences of them for the last 10 years. And I think now people are agitated and active. And so there's been a lot of stopping or stalling of these projects, but this is not sustainable, as somebody on the front lines. And so why can't our land use process look something more like participatory budgeting, for example, right? Where community members meet in gyms and discuss the needs for community resources, and then community leaders are appointed to like craft those into real tangible plans, and then community members vote on those plans in the spring by popular vote or something like that. And those kinds of changes do require like charter changes. But there's other, within the context of charter changes, if community members get a petition of 50,000 signatures, that can translate into a charter change. And so there are opportunities here to really change the community land use process. And we have plenty of evidence that the way that we're doing things are not working for the majority of people and are actually like pushing working class and communities of color out of the city. So I think I'll end it there. Yeah.
Thank you, Kristen. I mean, since you brought up. Oh, there's echo. So Corey Johnson has proposed a community planning. The name is escaping me for what it's called, but basically comprehensive plan, right? Like New York City doesn't really have a master plan, right, for development. It's all very piecemeal. So he has put forth a kind of comprehensive plan for New York City, which is supposed to, be more engaging. And I know that there were just hearings in the city council recently about this. I mean, just really quickly, like, what's your take on that?
So I'm not as up to speed on that as I should be, but I think there's two things that I'm thinking. One, what I understand about it is that it does create kind of like a dictator of development in some ways, right? Like people refer to this as like a Robert Moses figure. So it sounds to me, and this comprehensive plan that they're planning, it sounds to me like they're trying to lock the community out of making any decisions. Like they're trying to create almost an automatic process whereby if a developer proposes a project that's within some kind of the boundaries of this comprehensive plan, that it's like an automatic go. That's really dangerous, in part because none of the sort of larger political interests have changed and communities have less say in these processes, right? And to the point about community land trusts and things, and I think the future for development, we need to really start creating sort of these real local economies, and protect communities from speculative financial capitalism, because that's kind of where the danger is, and even create different relationships with banks, right? Or create different financial institutions. The comprehensive plan instead moves us in a direction where we actually are more open to financial interests, and the interests of that global financial class. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So it's 9:05, but I wanted to give people an opportunity to ask any questions that they may have about anything speakers have said, or just anything else having to do with housing or development. I know Rebecca wants to know about the unoccupied buildings next to Rainey. You mean those two kind of high rises, Rebecca? Is that what you're talking about? I don't know if Rebecca's still here.
I'm here. I just couldn't unmute.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because they've been vacant for as long as I can remember, and they've looked like they've been basically done. So I was just wondering if anybody knew anything about them. But I see that other people have questions. So
Okay. All right. So I don't know the answer to that. I know that rezoning was approved before 2010. I think it was 2008 or 9, before I joined the community board. And then all of a sudden they kind of went up. But I don't know if they're completely finished, but yeah, they're close to being done.
There was a good question in the chat for Stan about what can we do to best support Nycha residents in the fight against RAD?
Sure. One thing is pressure your elected officials to find out where they really stand. Because one of the problems we have is that it's very, very difficult to find out where most of these elected officials stand on these issues. They're very quiet. We also find that many of them are in support of, these privatization plans. So definitely pressuring your elected officials to find out where they stand will be good. And also join us. The more people outside of NYCHA that joins in these fights, the better off we all will be. It's not just NYCHA residents that are fighting. It's a citywide issue. So come out when we're able to have meetings again, or join us on Zoom and get involved in it, because we need your support. It has to be the whole city fighting for NYCHA in a sense, because once NYCHA goes, there is no more affordable housing in New York at all. That's the last of it.
Carolina, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm curious. So, in the current model that we have, with outside private developers coming into areas and making developments, so let's say, what is an ideal situation as far as holding private investors for development accountable for meaningful, affordable housing? If we were to split, sorry, my cat, if we were to split the middle with where we are now with, the beautiful model of a CLT or something that's much more equitable for everybody, I'm just really curious what you all experts think that would look like. What are things that could be happening right now?
I think this is also why the elections this year are so important too, though. Like, right, the way that I think we create political will is by putting people in office who like are among us. And I think so. One of the things Justice for All has been doing is calling for an eviction moratorium, right, and continuing to try to do that. And I think the more people that amplify that call right now, and there's lots of reasons to do that, not only because of the development, but also because we're in a pandemic still, right, and so people are recovering, even so, if they're not are still dealing with it, and there's lots of issues, not just the virus, but and then I think in terms, then that gives like some breathing room to actually push through some legislation. And I think like rent control for everybody at the state level is really important. And I think pushing for public housing, not for privatization, but for the expansion. And one thing that the Green New Deal for public housing does is, or works in tandem with, is getting rid of the Faircloth Amendment, so that the federal mandate preventing more public housing is lifted. And then it's a matter of, budget justice and things like that. It is a big, Memo's definitely right about the issue of political will, for sure. It's difficult within that context, but I think that there are some opportunities here right now in the next year that are worth pushing on a little bit.
Memo just had like a comment about land use committees on community boards. The thing is that boards are advisory, but I'm on the land use committee for Community Board 1. We do have influence, right? Because ultimately it is going to be the city council who makes the decision as to whether or not property should be rezoned, right? And as we talked about earlier, when you rezone, it increases the value. But the developers do have to build, it's mandatory inclusionary housing. Part of the problem, like Memo said, is that it's at levels that are much higher than what the area median income is for the actual community. Those rates are set by HUD. They incorporate income levels of Westchester and wealthier areas. It's not just New York City. So, that formula is kind of out of our control as a community board. But one of the things that we do control is pushing back on the options that the developers are offering for the housing. So in other words, we can say, well, we don't want, option 2. Option 2 is like any affordable units will be at 80% of the area median income. We can say we want the deeply affordable option, which is 60% or 40%, because then those units will actually be affordable to the people who live in that community, right? They're limited right now, but that means you also have to grant the rezoning, right? So when they get that rezoning, but if a rezoning is going to happen, insisting on the deeper affordability levels, that is one tool that, community boards can use to try and at least of affordable units that will be created, those can actually address the needs of the surrounding community. But on the other hand, you're still going to have over 70% of luxury units. So I do just want to be mindful of time. It's 9:15. Does anyone have a burning question? A burning question. Okay. Well, I want to thank our panelists so much for being here tonight. Thank you for being here tonight. We have, if you want to go and check out my housing policy platform, it's on my website. Our website is actually going to relaunch at some point this week, redesign, but there's more information there on what we can do on the city level, right? Like we can't cancel rent. We can't do, certain things we just can't do on the city level, but there are things that we can do, like looking at basement conversion programs, or looking at, making HPD more, strengthening it so that they can enforce fines, right? There are landlords who get away with violations and never pay a dime, right? So that is something that, the city can work on. So there are some things that can happen on that level. But obviously it's important to coordinate with our state and our federal electeds as well, to really push for housing as a human right? Everyone should have a decent home to live in at an affordable price. So with that, thank you all. And I don't know. Appreciate the panelists. Thank you. Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Rohit, and thanks all who participated tonight. And you go check out, the work of the Western Queens Community Land Trust and Justice for All, and Astoria Tenant Union. There's like really good work happening in this community. So that's yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
definitely. Thanks a lot for this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
You